So once again, I'd like to welcome everybody to this month's Wildlife for Lunch webinar. It's going to be on diseases affecting white-tailed deer in Texas, presented by Ryan Schoeneberg, the Big Game Program Specialist with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. This month's webinar is made possible through funding provided by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition Incorporated, and it's hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Ryan, with that, I'll pass the controls over to you, and you should be good to go.
All right, got a mic check. You hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right, good deal. All right, well, this is new for me. I've never actually done a presentation on the web before. It's probably the first presentation I could ever go to in my boxers and not be laughed at. But anyways, did want to talk a little bit about the diseases affecting nature. Before that, a little introduction of myself. My name is Ryan Schoeneberg. I'm the Big Game Program Specialist for Texas Parks and Wildlife. Been in the department a little over 10 years now. In the Big Game Program for about half of that. My title is Big Game Program Specialist. I've been lobbying to get that changed to Big Game Program Generalist, mainly because I don't actually have a job description. I just do whatever is the hot button of the day, go wherever I need. My boss refers to me as the rover, so just trying to do a little bit of anything and everything. Diseases is a niche that I've just kind of fallen into. Because we, just until recently, didn't have a vet on staff, but now he and I are working closely in addressing all diseases across the state. Example of what goes on around the state is on this opening slide here, actually not around the state, but around the nation, is this deer in the picture. Don't really know what's going on with it. You know, as populations are increasing around the nation, we start to see things that really are unexplained and stuff that's pretty rare and until recently, you know, haven't ever been seen. This animal, it's called the Bullwinkle syndrome, obviously, because its nose is swollen up like a moose. It has a higher load of bacterial content in it that's causing that swelling, almost like a Botox injection, and maybe that's the problem. It had one too many Botox injections, but they really don't know what actually causes it. And so this is just a good example, not something I know of ever in Texas, but it is something that is going on around the nation. I do appreciate y'all spending your lunch hour with us, and for that reason, I'll try to respect that and keep my talk short. Which I thought this was a good picture to illustrate that. This is another example of something you probably don't see ever, if not very often. This is a deer picture that was sent to me by one of our vets that we work very closely with. He had this picture sent to him. It's out of a camp that's kind of in north central Texas. But it's probably not something you'd ever see. It's not a very good survival tool to have extremely short legs. I imagine it wouldn't do very good or outrunning predators. But it's just a trait that, you know, shows that deer have similar traits to what people have. Not everything that affects a deer and affects an animal's health is truly a disease or a virus. We've coined the phrase recently, actually it was probably coined in the livestock industry, of hardware disease. It's something that is extremely pertinent to deer across the state, as you know, as we have gone out and moved off into the deer's habitat and started creating little subdivisions, especially subdivisions with, you know, green space and things like that. It's perfect deer habitat. Well, as those deer do what they normally do, rubbing antlers, rubbing the velvet off, fighting, sparring, whatever they're doing, they tend to tangle up in all kinds of stuff. Both of these pictures you see here are pictures of deer that have gotten tangled. One's in a soccer goal, one of them's in a, looks like a volleyball net. But we see them in all kinds of stuff, everything from water mains and drains and, come on, there we go. Such as this one right here, it's tangled up in a bucket. I've seen them with basketballs and everything else. And the question is how do we address it? You know, is this something affecting animals' health? Well, for that specific animal, yeah, probably so. Is it a population limiting factor? Not that much. And so do we address it on a case-by-case scenario? Do we have enough time, etc.? And so it's become a pretty hot-button issue with us on how do we address these things. And really, we take them one at a time. We basically look at that and say, is this becoming a public safety concern? Is this deer going to wander out into traffic and cause a wreck because it can't see? then we'll start to talk about it. But it's just something that's very interesting that's really come to the forefront in the last 2 to 3 years. Testosterone imbalances. Real quick 101 on antler development, and this is very rudimentary. That testosterone, as testosterone increases in a buck, it starts to grow antlers. And when the testosterone peaks at a level, that's when that velvet sheds. And when the testosterone levels really drop off, those antlers are cast. Sometimes there's things that happen that, as in this case, in this picture you see on here, you get something called a cactus buck. As the antler started to develop, something caused the testosterone levels to not ever get to that peak level, and so those antlers just continue to grow. Example of things that can happen that cause those testosterones to stop is in the picture here. I know it's lunch. If you're eating your lunch, I'll change the slide quickly so you don't have to look at this too long. But there are things that go on in the wild, and this is also why does can grow antlers, because if they get a testosterone spike, like a cyst on their ovary or something like that, you know, there's times where does actually can grow their antlers. If you've never been to the Buckhorn Hole of Horn and Buckhorn Saloon there in San Antonio, they've got tons of examples with this. It's a true treasure of lots of those good samples, and I highly recommend going by there. You see all kinds of cactus bucks and things of that nature. All right, some things to keep in mind when dealing with any animals. If you're hunting or if you're out in the wild, if you like to be outside, is the word zoonotic. If you've never heard that, I would suggest writing it down, doing a quick Google search. But a quick synopsis of what that is a disease that can be transmitted from humans to animals. Most of the diseases we have in humans today were at one time in your wild population in animals, and have jumped that species barrier normally by living in close contact with those animals. But, you know, in today's society, we should not be affected by those because we have things like rubber gloves. Look in the picture down in the bottom right-hand corner, you see the people in there, they're taking some kind of diagnostic sample from the angle they're going in there. It must be a CWD sample or something like that. I just think it's very interesting that the person that's on top of the picture has rubber gloves on, using utensils, even has a pair of rubberized pants on, and the other hands you see coming in the picture have nothing on. They're just holding the sample. And so one person is obviously concerned about the disease and the other person is obviously not. But just want to use this as a quick note to let you know that there are diseases that are in the wild that we don't want to get. And I have found the species, or what the little boy is causing that species barrier to jump. So if we could ever find this boy, I think we're going to be able to cut out about half of those zoonotic diseases. Deer mortality is common. It happens. Deer die. That picture illustrates that. That buck has slipped into that crack there. Deer die. And our population models, we normally figure about 10% of deer are going to die annually from fighting, car crashes, you name it, diseases. And so it happens. And so we shouldn't be too worried about that. Diseases become more apparent and more prevalent in populations that are overcrowded or poor conditions. And so for any deer managers that are listening, you want to make sure that you're not over that carrying capacity. That carrying capacity is called carrying capacity because that's how many animals should be on the range. It's how much food you have available for them. And if you run out of food, then the animals start to stress, and little bitty parasites or, you know, a cut that shouldn't have been that big of a deal now becomes infected, you know, just as they're starting to stress out. A lot of times when you do have a death, so you find an animal that's dead on your property, it's very difficult to diagnose what happened. An example of that is not too long ago, had a landowner call. They had a sick deer on the property. I showed up. Sure enough, the animal didn't look good. The humane thing there was to euthanize it, and then we decided we're going to get it tested. So we used a rifle, euthanized the animal, sent it off to the diagnostic lab. The diagnosis came back as for mortality, he died from a gunshot wound. Well, I know that because I was there when it happened, but it just kind of shows that they're going to be looking for the common causes. But even then, the rest of their diagnoses were there were some bacteria loads there, nothing that was hugely unusual, had some titers for EHD, which we'll talk about later. Nothing really conclusive about why that animal was so poor. And so were the bacteria there because the animal was drugged down by something else? We really have no idea. But in that scenario, it was only one deer on that property that was sick. And as we just mentioned, deer get sick, they die from all kinds of reasons, just like people do. And so one deer is not really a concern. It's when we have 10 deer, and 10 deer in a short time frame. So if you go out to the property on Wednesday to feed the cows and everything looks good, and then go back out there Saturday and you find 10, 15, 20 dead deer laying around, that's a problem. Now we got something we need to look at. And so by the same token, 10 deer over a year and a half, well, maybe that's not a problem. That's an example of that was a lady called, and she had actually, I think it's 12 deer that she had found. Once we got to talking about it, it was 12 deer in the last year and a half. And we finally realized that her property was close to a major road, and so most of those were likely hit and then made it a little ways off the road and onto her property. And so the take-home message is that deer do die, and it's when several deer are dying in a very short time frame that we need to be paying attention to it. Okay, shifting gears a little bit and kind of getting to the meat and potatoes of the talk. A little pop quiz for you. All these states on this list have something extremely in common, and they're in order. And here's your hint. If you guess chronic wasting disease, you're right. There are 22 states in the United States that have chronic wasting disease in it. Texas is included in that. Chronic wasting disease is a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. What that basically is, transmissible meaning that it's one animal can give it to another, and that's a little bit different from like contagious. You think of contagious like the flu or something like that, where something sneezes and those germs are out there in the air. CWD is not quite that infectious. One animal will get it from the next animal, but it's going to be from nose-to-nose contact or from picking up the prions. Spongiform encephalopathy, sponge, encephalopathy, that means the brain, so it turns the brain to a sponge. That's how it manifests itself. CWD attacks the brain and other neurological tissue of your cervid species. So the perils of CWD are, CWD is caused by a prion. Prion is a little word for protein infectious, which basically means that it's a rogue protein that misfolds, that no idea what causes it, what starts it, but when this protein misfolds, it touches another protein, causes it to misfold, and therefore they replicate and cause other proteins to misfold, and so therefore it just starts to take over the whole body. One of the interesting things there that always boggles my mind is a protein's not alive. Protein, if you remember back to your high school chemistry, it's, to me, I look at this like this little alien creature. So if it's not alive, how can it be killed? And that's part of the problem. You can't have vaccines for it. The only way to neutralize CWD or protein or prion is to soak it in a 50-50 bleach solution or cook it at about 1400 degrees for 30 minutes. So short of a nuclear attack, and once those proteins get in an environment, they're there forever. And that's one of the scary parts is that, if you have an area that has CWD in it, and as those deer are shedding proteins through saliva and urine and feces and through animal matter, once that animal perishes, that area is infected. And so that's part of the problem is even if you removed all the animals off that area, let it go dormant for a couple of years, put more animals back out there, chances are they're going to be able to pick up those proteins, and now you'll have CWD all over again. And there's no genetic immunity, meaning that every animal can get it. There's some talk now about some animals that are a little less susceptible to it, but as far as we know, every animal can get it, and every animal that gets it will die from it. And some of those susceptibility issues are they might live a little bit longer, but they still will die from it. And that's why it's an issue for everybody that's involved in deer management is once you get it, you can't get rid of it. Every animal can get it, and every animal will die from it once they do get it. That's a big concern. And so because of that, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth an immeasurable amount of cure in this scenario. So what happened is we got CWD out here. Let's see if I can get this tool to work. Right there in El Paso County and Hudspeth County line, just right there where that arrow is. So New Mexico, they were out there doing some random testing, found 2 positives about a mile and a half from our border, and gave us a call and pretty much told me that when they found that, we said, okay, we need to do some strategic samplings. If it's a mile and a half from our border, average mule deer home range is about 25 miles. So that probably means that we've got it. So we need to go out there and find out what's actually going on. So we went out there, did a little bit of testing in that vicinity, and sure enough, we came up with 2 positives on our side of the border, and that allowed us to start to try to mitigate that risk. And that mitigation looks basically what you see in this map. And so we have 3 zones. We have the containment zone in the dotted red and white. Then you got the high-risk zone here in the yellow, and the buffer zone there in the blue. And really what you'd look at is this kind of looks funny because it's up against Mexico and New Mexico, but it's kind of a bullseye effect, if you will. What we wanted to do is we wanted to be able to isolate off where that CWD was over here in the containment zone and have some restrictions on what deer can move, and mandatory check stations and things like that, and then ease those restrictions as you move out. But we also wanted to be prudent because we don't know what the geographic distribution or the prevalence of this disease is yet. So we're just trying to make sure we're being prudent and being able to isolate it. And then over time, we'll be able to have a better idea. So chronic waste disease manifests itself as emaciation, excessive drooling, staggering, orientation, or disorientation, walking in circles. These are the same symptoms of any other neurological disease. So just because you see an animal out there drooling, that's not a big deal. If you see an animal staggering around, well, maybe we'd call that a clinical symptom animal. We would want to get it tested for CWD, certainly. But just because you see an animal doing that, it could be any host of things that are actually causing problems. So we'll talk about some more of those later, but abscesses, rabies, things like that all look very similar in their symptoms. So CWD, as far as we know, is not transmissible to man. Now, we say that a little bit cautious just because we don't want to have a problem with it. You know, so if you were out hunting in an area that has CWD in it, you want to make sure you do things like debone all your meat because those prions tend to congregate in areas of neurological tissue, your brain, spinal cord, eyes. So remove all that, make sure you don't eat it. And then harvesting an animal that's in good physical condition, that's just a good rule of thumb always. We want to make sure that we're eating the healthy animals and not eating something that is potentially sick and can harm us. So the last slide about CWD is that since 2002, since CWD became a big public topic, we have been testing CWD. Since then, we have tested in Texas 26,209 samples. That's a lot of samples, and that's just the ones that have come back from the lab saying that we're confident this was a good test. You know, if anybody has done any type of testing, there are different results you can get that they're still tested, but we don't have extreme confidence that it was the right tissue or the right location on that tissue. So it's just 26,000 good tests. What this basically has done, and these are statewide, these are random sampling, they're done all over the state, and what we've been able to do is give us some confidence that the disease is not running rampant through our state. We're testing at a 95% confidence that this disease is not at a 1% prevalence. Well, if you know much about CWD, 1% prevalence, that's starting to get a notable amount of disease out there. So all we're really able to do is say that the disease is not running rampant throughout our state. All right, changing gears, another little pop quiz for you. And guess who that is? This person died of tuberculosis. Actually, at the time, they called it consumption. And you're no daisy at all if you didn't guess that was Doc Holliday. Tuberculosis is another disease that really concerns us in our state. As far as we know, we don't currently have it, and by that I mean it's not out in the wild. There are instances of people that have it, and every once in a while we find a cow or something like that has it, and we take it very seriously and do lots of surveillance around that area to make sure it's not running rampant. But tuberculosis is a bacteria, so therefore, if you know about bacteria, you can treat them pretty well with antibiotics. It can affect all animals, including humans, all mammals, including humans. So that's why it's a big concern, is this is a zoonotic disease. Normally you find it in the respiratory tract, and if you're cleaning an animal and you notice that the lungs are stuck to the walls, or the lungs feel like they're a sack full of BBs, that's a pretty good sign of tuberculosis. And so what really the problem with it is, and the reason we're concerned about it, is there are states, specifically up north, that have TB in the wild. It roots in all the deers and the possums and the coons and the coyotes. And short of a huge financial input, they're not able to eradicate it. So there's 10 and 15 county areas up there that are not TB free, and so I have more restrictions put on it. So it's just another thing we want to keep out. All right, that's the big ones. Now we're going to move into the other things that you're going to see a little bit more commonly throughout when you're hunting. Nasal bots. That's probably the single biggest question that I or any other biologist across the state get asked about. A hunter comes and calls and says, I just shot an animal and it's hanging in the garage and it already has maggots coming out of its nose, and they're freaking out that something was wrong with it. Anybody who collects CWD samples, therefore cutting into the throat or does lots of aging, I'm sure you see them a lot, but the average hunter doesn't actually do that, so they probably don't even know that the majority of the animals that they're harvesting have these nasal bots. So what a nasal bot is just the larval stage of a botfly. That botfly lays his eggs on the nose of the deer. Deer licks his nose at some point, swallows that nasal fly, or that fly egg, and it goes into the back of its throat, gets into that mucosa, and just basically lives there, feeding off the mucus and hanging out there. Doesn't affect the deer's health at all. Pretty much just hangs out there feeding on the mucus until it gets to the mature larva stage, which in the bottom picture is the brown one right there. Once it does that, climbs out of its nose, falls on the ground, starts the cycle over again. So definitely not something to worry about. It's something that is very common. Arterial worm is something else that looks very interesting in its manifestation. If you look in this picture here, you'll see the big jaw on the deer. Looks like it's holding its mouth or blowing bubbles in its cheeks. So arterial worm is spread by the horsefly. There's a picture of it here, if it would go. But it's spread by the horsefly, and as that horsefly bites it, it spreads that arterial worm. Arterial worm causes muscle paralysis in the cheeks, or actually causes it wherever it was biting them. And you can imagine that if you can't move your cheek, you can't keep that food moving backwards into the teeth and on down the stomach. And so it causes an impaction. And over time, that impaction gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Really, the arterial worms don't directly harm the animal. You can imagine that if you've had food in your mouth for a month or 2 or 3, I'd imagine that bacterial load will start to build up and start to cause some secondary infections. Cutaneous fibroma is something else that growing up, I'd never heard of it, I'd never seen it, but still hunt on those properties today, and we're starting to notice it. And I think it's probably also a function of the increase in animal densities, etc. So cutaneous fibroma is cutaneous, which basically means on the skin. So it's just a wart that lives on the skin. It's caused by a virus, which does mean that animals can spread it from one animal to another, but it's not something that actually affects the animal health until, as you notice in this picture on the right, this animal right here, look at his ribs, starting to get very emaciated. You can see its hind legs or its back hips. The reason for that is it's not necessarily because of the fibroma, but where they're growing. If you start to notice that they're all over his mouth and his nose, this animal's having problems just seeing, probably having problems breathing, certainly having problems feeding, just because I'm sure those things start to hurt as they get raw, and they start to just have trouble getting to the food. So realistically, it's not a herd health concern, but the animals that get it can certainly cause them some problems. And you normally see this in an animal that has already something that's causing it down, pulling the body condition down, parasites or a broken leg. And so as an animal starts to get sicker, it allows that virus to really take over and cause these warts. But it can also happen where that animal, once it gets healthier, they dry up and actually fall off too. EHD and blue tongue. These are actually two different diseases. They are always lumped together. Anytime you hear somebody talking about EHD or talking about blue tongue, they're going to be talking about them synonymously. The reason being is that their symptoms are identical. In fact, my understanding of it is you have to run a DNA test on the virus to figure out which one is it. Was it EHD or blue tongue? So we always talk about them synonymously, so I'll talk about them today similarly. It is caused by a virus. And it's something that in Texas we don't have to worry about as much as in other states. If you ever read some of the blogs or whatever, some of those northern states, they'll have die-offs of hundreds of deer in a single year due to EHD or blue tongue. And the reason for that is if you've ever gotten a flu shot and think that you're inoculated, well, what they're inoculating you for is the most common types of flu that you're likely to get that year. Well, then you still come down with the flu and say, oh, my flu shot didn't work. Well, it worked. It's just that you got a different strain or a different serotype of it. In EHD, it's the same thing. There's a bunch of serotypes of it. In Texas, the most common serotypes are serotype 2 and 1. And here in the last few years, we've been seeing a few more die-offs from EHD because EHD 6 has come in. So basically what we see is a fawn is born, or EHD comes into an area, and its first year that animal's alive, it gets inoculated or it doesn't survive. So as the EHD comes through, that animal either makes it or it doesn't. And once it makes it, it builds up titers against it and is better able to fight off that virus next time it gets exposed to it. And then something like EHD 6 comes along and basically sets it back and has to either fight it off or doesn't fight it off all over again. Down here is the examples. The pictures on the bottom are the examples of what actually EHD looks like when it's being manifested. The picture I just pointed at right there is the most common form or the most common symptom that you would see when you're looking for it, is ulcers on the tongue. And blue tongue gets its name because it actually causes the tongue to turn blue. So as the animal is hemorrhaging and blood's clotting, and so it's going to start to cause things to cause problems. And those ulcers and blue tongue are the most common ones. You can see other things like hoof problems and stomach lining problems, but most of the time you're going to see those if you're really doing an intense look to try to figure out what that problem is. But EHD, yes, it's a problem. Yes, it kills lots of deer every year, but it's an insect vector that causes this. So it's spread by the Culicordes midge fly. This little fly right here is, as it comes in, this is no-see-ums is another common name for them. If you're ever out dove hunting, this is a little fly that's constantly in your ears, your nose, and your mouth, and just choking you up. This is the type of gnat that is doing it. It's the Culicordes species specifically that actually is spreading that disease. So where I was going with this is the good thing about EHD is being an insect vector. The very first frost you get, those insects die back, the outbreak's over with. So as bad as it gets, you kind of know when it's going to end. There at least is an end in sight. Something else that's commonly asked to a lot of biologists is deer that just look really poor. Most of the time we get these questions, these emails and pictures that come up right after the winter time when it starts warming up. Animals start to shed their winter coat, and we don't see as much in Texas as north, but where they have the real thick winter coats and shedding it in place of their summer coats, it can really look poor. And also pecking orders is another explanation for that. And, as animals are establishing dominance, and especially around feeders and such, you're going to start to see them pulling hair out of each other. Doe do it a lot. And mange is another example of that. So much so that I've got a slide just on mange. Really, I didn't hear about mange too much until the last few years. As deer densities are increasing, you're going to start to hear about it more. There's two types of mange, demodectic and sarcoptic. Most of the time, what you're going to see in deer is the demodectic, which is caused by a mite. One of them is a mite that lives in the hair follicle, and the other one's a mite that lives on top of the skin. And so when they're living in the hair follicle, it's going to cause hair loss. That hair falls out. The animal's miserable, and so it's just scratching and trying whatever it can do to scratch that next itch. And so you're going to see lots of movement of the animal trying to scratch it. Actually, it's interesting because I'm waiting on the next news article to come out with a chupacabra deer, because that's what our chupacabras that are all out is, just a coyote with mange. As it has no hair on it, it's starting to, scratch itself and really look miserable. One of these days, we're going to get that news story. All right, next one is anthrax. Anthrax is a very scary word for most people, and it should be. I mean, it's something that is zoonotic. It is something that can hurt people. But ever since 9/11, anthrax, when it was sent around the post offices, really became a household word. Anthrax is something that it's a bacteria that lives in the soils in certain areas, and I've got some maps coming up that'll show you exactly where. But the stuff that's out there in the soils is not the same stuff that's being sent around in the mail. That stuff is weaponized anthrax, and it's made to be very infectious. I'm not saying not to downplay anthrax. I mean, it's still bad stuff, but it's not the same scary stuff that terrorists are using. So what anthrax basically is a bacteria that gets into an animal. As far as I know, anthrax can lay in the soil dormant for years, hundreds of years. It's got a very tough outer coat on it. And what actually causes an animal to pick it up out of the soil is still yet a mystery, whether it's, animals feeding close to the ground or a plant has picked it up. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but as an animal gets the anthrax spores in it, it starts to cause hemorrhaging and can cause a very quick death, in the tune of about 6 to 8 hours in some cases, depending on how much anthrax spores they picked up. And so it is something that can be very significant, because it can kill any mammal. If people get into it, in fact, there was an outbreak over there in Edwards County that a person even got some. They thought an animal had been poached. They were out there trying to dig around, look for a bullet hole, and that person was in the hospital, last I heard, being treated for anthrax. And so, I mean, it's something to know about, especially if you're in an area that has anthrax in it, endemically. But just this year, in fact, just this week, came an announcement from Texas Animal Health Commission that they found anthrax down near Corpus Christi, down in Jim Wells County. So it's something to know about. The symptoms, basically, of it are, since it causes hemorrhaging, you're going to see blood coming out of all the orifice: ears, eyes, nose, mouth, anus. And so it's just, if you're seeing that, an animal is basically otherwise healthy with blood coming out those orifices, don't touch it, go wash your hands. So here's a map, and it's going to start flipping through this. So I want to give you a little bit of direction of what you're going to look at as it flips through here. So over here on the side is the year, and everything in red is the counties. And so as it flips through, you'll be able to see that over the last set of years, how anthrax has pretty much isolated itself. So in 1952, you can see that it was found pretty widely across the state of Texas. In 1988, kind of isolated. 1998, you see it down in South Texas. In 2001, this is where we are now, that this is pretty much the golden triangle for anthrax. So if you live in one of these 5 counties or hunt in one of these 5 counties, you want to do a little research about anthrax and what it is and how it manifests itself, just to be able to know the signs and symptoms and be able to know what not to touch. Right down here, one of these little counties down here is where they found that anthrax case here this week, where they confirmed it. So these 2 animals have something in common. And this is what people always think of when they see a bat on the ground or a skunk, and with good reason. Rabies is a viral disease. It is most commonly found in the saliva. That's why bites from a rabid animal are extremely dangerous. And so all mammals are susceptible, including humans. But, you know, rabies is one of those things that if you're on top of it and you're being vigilant, you're being proactive, is a very treatable disease. And obviously not in wildlife because we can't get our hands on them, but this is what people think of when they think of rabies. They've got a deer down here that's just going to chase you and try to attack you. While that is you know, folklore, that's the old Yeller version of it. This is the most common scenario. So this fawn right here was this was a scenario that played out. A lady was getting up to go to work, walked out, and basically found this fawn on her driveway. She went and picked it up, and it stood up and staggered off 3 steps to the right and fell over. And then we picked it up again, it staggered 3 steps to the left and fell over again. So being the animal lover she was, she picked it up, took it in the house. The kids were sitting there watching cartoons, and by the time the animal rehabilitator got there, the deer was sitting on the house wrapped in a blanket watching cartoons with the kids. And you know, that's all fine and dandy, but first thing that animal health care specialist looked at was there's something neurologically wrong with it. So they got the animal tested for rabies, and sure enough, it came back positive. And so then the whole family had to start on post-prophylactic shots and the whole 9 yards of trying to make sure that they weren't going to get rabies. So it's just, rabies is one of those things that it can occur in white-tailed deer, but, you know, just use a little bit of common sense. If an animal's not acting normally, you probably don't want to take it and watch cartoons with it. So ectoparasite is something that is talked about a lot, something that most hunters are going to be noticing as they're processing their game. The 2 most common ones are ticks and keds. Keds doesn't really need to be talked about much, but I did want to mention it because most hunters see them and think that they're ticks. So the difference actually is a ked is going to be the 6-legged animal that's moving around on there, or parasite moving around on the animal. The keds feed off of dead skin cells, feed off of blood meals. It's actually interesting because keds are going to be pretty much single host. They'll fly onto an animal. They have wings. As soon as they get onto their host animal, they break their wings off. That's now their animal. They're not going to leave it like a tick will. Ticks get the rap of being disease little vectors, and they are. They're going to be spreading things like Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and so anything you can do to mitigate your exposure to ticks while out in the field or processing game, you're going to be well ahead of the curve. And so if you get a tick bite, make sure you're watching it, make sure it doesn't get a bullseye is the telltale sign of it getting something like a Lyme disease. So make sure that you're paying attention to anywhere you get a tick bite. And I mentioned lice on here, and hopefully I'll never have to do a presentation just on that. By that I mean that California is right now dealing with a lice epidemic. They've got an exotic lice that has come into their animals, and they're actually having whole population die-offs due to this lice. not necessarily just because of the lice, but those lice are causing the hair to fall out, and it's really hard to make it through a very cold winter without any hair. And so hopefully we're able to keep that out of Texas, but we do have some forms of lice around Texas also. Fever tick, and I separated this out. I mean, it's still a tick, but I separated it out because of the importance of it. So back in 1893, the Texas Animal Health Commission was formed for this very critter right here, because these fever ticks were coming in, and they carry a little blood parasite in their gut, and next time they bite an animal, they infect that animal, and it's basically causing reproduction loss or production loss in the cattle industry in the areas that it's present. And so what we need to make sure we're doing is being cognizant of the fact that these, they've got a quarantine zone down here. That's what all these zones are in yellow. So if you hunt in these areas and live somewhere else, you want to make sure that you're not bringing some ticks back to your area and starting another little hotbed. So pretty much the Texas Animal Health Commission has done an extremely good job of keeping this disease right there along the border, not allowing it to come up, hence the quarantine zone. And so the cattle have to be scratched or checked for ticks before they leave that quarantine zone. There's been some finger pointing lately that deer are another vector for spreading it out of there. So while it's not mandatory right now, it would be pertinent to check your animal and make sure that any ticks coming out of there are either off the animal or gone before that animal leaves that ranch. Hoof rot is something else that pops up on occasion around Texas. It's actually caused by the bacteria Fusiform necrophorum, Fusobacterium necrophorum, excuse me. It's similar to EHD. EHD is how it manifests itself as causing lesions and things like that. The primary difference is there's no insect vector. It's going to be primarily from infected soil. So as this animal is moving through an area, it's going to have these bacteria on its feet. You can see this animal right there has extremely swollen feet. And so, as bacteria lays in the soil, it's called hoof rot. It's a bacteria that can affect anything from its mouth to, you can see some lesions there on its chest, but primarily in its feet because as it has a cracked hoof or hoof damage or something like that, walks through an animal or area, and this bacteria now enters its feet. And so it's not a population limiting deal because it is pretty sporadic, but unlike EHD, it doesn't have an insect vector that will die off at the freeze, so this pretty much just has to run its course. It's actually interesting though, you'd think that you'd see this in wet years when you have lots of moist soil to really promote that bacteria, but actually we're seeing it more in dry years because of, my only guess is, you have fewer watering holes. So all the animals in this area are going to that one little hole in the creek and therefore picking up this bacteria. So something pretty interesting to watch for. So kind of starting to wrap things up a little bit, some things that you can expect to see are labeled in red here. So the nasal bots, cutaneous fibroma, hemorrhagic disease, ticks and kids, and rough coat. Those are the things that you would probably want to watch out for a little bit more or know something about because you're more likely to see those. But everything on here is extremely pertinent to our deer herd in Texas. So if you see something suspicious, definitely document it. This picture of this deer I thought was very cool that one of our vets sent to me. This actually is a suspicious looking animal, and no, this wasn't photoshopped, and that's why I put two pictures on here. It actually was a deer that just had one pedicel and it grew a spike right out the middle of its head, so pretty cool to watch. But if documenting what you see is extremely important to disease management. If you call me about this deer that's sick on your property, chances are you're not 5 minutes away from me, and so by the time I would be able to get there, the deer's moved off, you can't find it or something like that. So being able to get some good pictures, a great description of it, document what you see as time frame when you're seeing these sick animals, all that's extremely important to being able to get a picture of what's going on around the property. And if we can collect a specimen off of it, or if the animal is already, if it was a harvested animal, then we'd be able to really be able to get some diagnostic samples or something like that. There's a biologist assigned to every county in the state of Texas, and so there's going to be somebody who's fairly close to you that could be able to help out. So really the take-home message in this whole talk today is that wildlife do get sick and die. Deer do get sick from the same things that a lot of people get sick from. And being a hunter, you need to be careful of zoonotics. We want to make sure that any animal that gets sick is not something that we can pick up. So wearing gloves, washing your hands, just using some common sense precautions will curb most of those backwards. Not every dead animal is a wildlife emergency. An example earlier of 10 dead deer is now a problem, whereas one of them wasn't. Well, we don't know what the problem was until somebody calls. So send us pictures. I love to see pictures, even if it's just a, hey, kind of curious, hey, check this out. Would love to see it. If you're not sure, give us a shout. We'd like to check it out. I mean, we are in the business of managing the herd health throughout the state, and so we do want to make sure we're keeping our finger on the pulse. And being the people in the field, y'all are going to see it more often than we will. So give us a call. With that, that's pretty much all I have. This last little picture here is of a fawn actually in a breeding facility that has a huge tumor on it. They were actually able to remove the tumor, yet the animal didn't survive the trauma of it. It just goes to show again that animals are afflicted by numerous things. So my contact information is on here. I appreciate your participation today. Feel free to mark this down. This is my direct contact information, so feel free to call or email with any questions you may have. With Clint, I guess I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, I appreciate it, Ryan. We had just a couple questions come in, and I'll encourage everybody else to ask questions as we go through these. We still have a little bit of time to get to those. The first one is just asking if there'll be a PowerPoint or a PDF available of this presentation afterwards.
Asking me or asking you?
Asking you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, let me know. Take down my email address there, and I can certainly email you the presentation anytime.
Okay. Sounds good. And the next question is, what happens or manifests in deer with Lyme or fever disease from ticks? Will they die or infect others, or what becomes of that?
That's a good question. I'm not real sure, and I don't want to spread any misinformation. And I meant to caveat this earlier. I'm not actually a vet. I'm kind of a disease specialist by hard knocks. So I can certainly find that information out, shoot me an email, and I can dig into that for you. But I'm really not sure exactly how Lyme manifests in the deer. My hunch is that it doesn't do anything to them.
Okay. And so far, you're going to get off easy with just one question. Another one popped up, then why do they quarantine in regards to, I guess, fever ticks?
Well, the fever tick is a different deal than the Lyme disease. The fever tick is something that affects the livestock, and that's the reason for the quarantine zone. Is in 1983, when the Texas Animal Health Commission was formed, fever ticks were across the whole state of Texas. So they were able to, over time, systematically push that fever tick, got it all the way back to the border, and now Mexico is not doing anything to eradicate it on their side. So basically, we've drawn a line in the sand. We've quarantined off right there, just to the side of the border, so that we can monitor what's going on there. But the fever tick and the Lyme disease are two different beasts.